everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm the host, Sean Boyce. I'd like to welcome my guest to the show today, Tim Eulie from Eulie Creative. Hi, Tim. How are you? And thanks for being on the show.
Good. Hey, Sean. How are you doing? Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm very excited to dive into the topic more, which would be like usability, UX, things related to that. But before we do that, if you wouldn't mind, Tim, give our audience a little bit more information about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Sure, absolutely. So I work both UX and UI. I've been into creative work of some kind over the last 15 years. I went to school for film, did video production for a while. I got while I was doing video production and the people I met got me really interested in design in general. And that's when I found out that UX was a thing. The more I learned about it, it seemed like a great way to just bring value with my creative process, because before then, I always think I struggled a little bit to find where I could, provide value doing creative work, and also I could work on projects in technology, which also was really important to me. So I have studied over the last 5 years. I was studying UX, and then I started working freelance, and now I'm working for a few different companies. Working in a lot of logistical helping them work out software logistical problems, and designing their internal sites at the moment. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing your background. And I know we've talked at length previously at a number of different topics related to UX, which is what we want to dive into more here today. Really, UX, how I would summarize it in terms of how we've talked about it. It's UX as a competitive advantage. Nowadays, despite the fact that the industry continues to move forward, I still am regularly encountering products from time to time that I just feel I have a suboptimal kind of user experience. And I have a tendency to gravitate towards myself as a user, those that have a pleasant or a delightful user experience. So it makes a big difference in terms of how effectively software can solve problems for you. So I want to dive more into this as a topic, talk about any favorites or particular pet peeves you have when it comes to UX and design elements and software that you've used. But probably a great place to start is, what principles would you say are important for ensuring that you are investing as appropriately as you should and getting the most out of building a great user experience for a software product?
Sure. So just to start, I feel like the entire industry in software and technology is really now embracing design and the importance of it. I think part of that is just the saturation of all the different software spaces. You know what I mean? Your specific genre, you have to compete against a lot of different companies now. And so if you don't have solid UX, if you don't have solid UX, then people are going to just drop your software and move over to something else right away. The exceptions might be into super niche areas, but even in internal pieces of software that a company isn't really using for customer facing applications, it's going to affect their productivity, and that's going to affect how they can compete against their competitors. So I would say where we're at right now is that there's an awareness of how important this is. But I think one of the log jams that still exists is I don't think companies oftentimes know how to apply UX, know what's important in the process, and what's going to lead to best outcomes for their projects. And I think what needs to happen is people who are working in some field in UX need to communicate what's important in the project and how that's going to affect outcomes. So I think opportunities like this, where we get to speak on a podcast about it, is a great opportunity to kind of educate audiences who are trying to build a startup or improve their products, so they can get a better understanding of what kind of value that design can bring to them. I know you do strategy in particular, and I think, or you do strategy in the research in particular. And both those things are incredibly important to what the UX designers themselves are going to be able to do. Like if I don't have good information, actionable information, then I'm going to be really limited in my ability to know what the best choices are for the users. And I think like that's a big area, for instance, that a lot of companies are missing right now. And I hope that that is like in the same way that like people know that like, you know, contrast is important, you know what I mean? And hierarchy is important. I hope that we're getting to a place where like research is super important, and knowing the problems that their users are facing is going to like really impact the design process.
It's well said. I think I'm curious to get your take on this as well too, because I think the two mentioned a lot as almost synonymous, but I, you know, based on my experience in product, I obviously see them as distinct. And in a lot of cases, you know, you're focusing on one or the other, not necessarily both. But a lot of people quickly rattle off the UI, UX, and just like bundle them together. Whereas, you know, I see them as one being kind of the design of the interface and the other one, obviously, the experience. And that can mean something completely different. So I'm curious for you to kind of help us get a better understanding. And for those that aren't really sure, how would you define UX? And, you know, the simplest terms for folks to get a good understanding of what it is and what the purpose of it is and why we should focus on it.
Sure. So UX means user experience, and user experience. That's a good question. So when you open a piece of software, and you open it for the first time, you generally have certain goals when you open that piece of software. Not all the time. Sometimes you might be introduced to something, and you need to kind of explore to understand like what its potential is. But in general, let's say hypothetically, you own a company, right? And this company does a certain thing, and you use a piece of software to execute that thing. So you have particular goals, and you have particular actions that you want the user to take. Now, what a user experience designer is your UX designer is going to do is it's going to help connect those dots more or less for the user. They're going to understand how the user is approaching the piece of software and what needs to be communicated to the user and how it needs to be communicated to the user in order for them to help the company achieve their desired goals. So generally, like when I'm starting a new project, it's important for me to ask the company, like, what is your, you know what I mean? What are you trying to achieve here? You know what I mean? Like really broadly, like, what do you want the user to do when they come on your site? And then if they have an existing piece of software and we're kind of like improving it, like what are the major sticky points that are preventing your users from having a good experience? Or maybe an example might be like our users need to call customer service because, you know what I mean, they struggle to find these important documents on our site. You know what I mean? Well, why are they struggling to find the important documents on their site? You know what I mean? What are the bottlenecks that they're running into? And how can we better communicate to the user? So those are some examples of why user experience is important. It can lead to dissatisfaction, like we said before, with your customers, and it can also lead to like productivity issues. Does that help answer that question?
It's not an easy question to answer too, because it seems like it's such a simple concept, but it's really not. Experience very different than design, in my opinion. So, you know, the two obviously play together pretty importantly as you're talking about creating the experience, and the design plays a big part in that. But in terms of just describing the experience, I think it's something that's challenging to do in rather simple terms. So that's super helpful. And something else we talked about too, which is a concept I've studied as well too, like from the Norman Nielsen group, and in the book, The Design of Everyday Things, there's a concept in there which really changed my perspective on it to an extent, or made me think about the concept differently as it pertains to UX. I like to say that I had a strong preference for the tools that I use, and especially the ones that have like a pleasant or delightful user experience. I get frustrated when I'm trying new software and it's making me jump through extra hoops, or the performance isn't great, or I'm encountering errors, or it's taking longer than it should, or whatever it is, right? obviously I'm not talking necessarily about what they're doing technically, but the experience is what I'm really focusing on. And some provide just like an absolute delightful experience. And I could rattle off some examples, but the point that I'm referring to from that book that they talk about, which is like this concept of there is no such thing as user error. And that and we hear about this all the time, like those of us that have been in and around tech for so long. Whenever, if user does something incorrectly, or if there's a common mistake that gets made, and it could have been about something like physical or technical or whatever, and then it comes up in software a lot too. If that mistake gets made and it gets made repetitively, we would say something like that's a user error, like you're doing it wrong, right? There's a relatively like infamous incident from the history of Apple for when they released the iPhone 4 that had this antenna issue where based on, it was actually determined to be an actual defect in design, but the way that they responded to it was that they said that, well, not officially, I don't think, but the consensus kind of was, right, like that you're holding it wrong, which I always thought was a hilarious concept. And like, how do you hold a phone wrong? You know what I mean? But I think it does a decent job of underscoring kind of this point where it's like, if however users are deciding to hold your phone, and it wasn't like the iPhone was brand new at that time, right? There were many models of the iPhone before that, or different variations on that version of the iPhone. So they were holding it the same way they always been. It's not like it's this brand new concept that they've never seen before. Yet all of a sudden, because there is an issue, the blame kind of shifts to the user. And there was backlash, despite Apple's like ridiculously loyal following. There was backlash because of it, and you can certainly understand why. So anyway, you have more chops in this area than I do, and I want to get your take on something like that because I see it. I've come from that world where it's user error is talked about a lot, but I also can see, understand, and like respect the take of like if people are regularly making mistakes using your software, whether you have the ability experience-wise to like to correct them or redirect them in the right way. Perhaps it's something that needs to be redesigned because for whatever reason, right, those mistakes continue to get made.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have mixed feelings on this. To some, and I think we talked about this a little bit because I think generally, I think I'm going to agree most of the time. If you want your users to do like a certain thing and and they find it very challenging to do that thing that you want them to do, then you're probably going to have to make changes if you want them to be more successful at doing that thing. Like that's, absolutely. The area that I kind of struggle with on this a little bit is some applications need to do a lot of different things. And so there's going to be so on those applications, there's generally going to be an inevitable period where the user needs to explore, make mistakes, and understand where pieces are. And I think on those more complex applications, sometimes it's hard to differentiate between when a user is learning and when there's legitimate, like, oh, we need to redesign this. Because like when we talked about before, we talked about like Adobe products, for instance. I have Illustrator open up in my background right now, and it does a lot of different things. And I've been using Illustrator for a while, and I still need to refer to like just Google like, oh, how do you do this thing periodically, just because it does so many different things. And I have issues with Adobe products in a lot of ways where I think they do need to improve their user experience. But in general, I think it just does so many different things that, as a user, you need to take time to understand it. And sometimes there are some potential applications that it does that you're not even aware of because you never considered that this program might do this thing. So I have a really mixed feeling about that. And it generally comes down to like how complex is this piece of technology and how complex are the needs of the users here. Now, with that said, I think there's always room for iteration, and it just really ends up depending on like what's your client's budget for that and what is their like we can afford this amount of like user discomfort like when they're using this software. and their barrier will probably, a lot of it will depend on how much competition do they have in that space. Like going back to Adobe's like has almost a monopoly on a lot of design software tools. That's changing now a little bit, but in general, like they didn't have a ton of competition, so they oftentimes don't rush to improve a lot of user experience issues that are legitimate. Yeah, so I think so I have mixed feelings on that, just because sometimes it feels a little bit like the customer's always right, and the customer isn't always right. They just need to do a little bit of work there. But in general, I think I agree with the premise. Yeah.
I think that's a great distinction. It's not as clear cut. I mean, how I might interpret it based on different sources that I've read, conversations with people like yourself, professionals like yourself, more experience in this area than I do, is maybe essentially like there's no such thing as user error is a good thing to strive for, but it's not universal, right? There,
Yes.
as you said, the differentiation between learning is important, right? Because if you're making improvements, inevitably you're going to come across something that changes the way that it works. As
Yes.
such, that change is going to require you to have to jump through another hoop or two in order to experience it, right? So just because you're expecting it to do it one way, the way you're doing it now, different, you have to learn that, right? And that pain or frustration or whatever is associated with the learning experience, it's not something you can just get rid of all the time, right? Because inevitably, as these things change, you're going to have to learn something.
I don't know if you ever played like video games in particular.
Yeah, a little bit.
And I think video games
my system was N64.
Okay, yeah.
So a million years ago.
Like sometimes when you pick up a new game, at first you don't necessarily have immediate fun, because you kind of need to figure out how the thing works. And a good once again, a good user experience generally will make that process as painless as possible, but you need you need to get around and you need to explore how the controls work and stuff like that in order to really start enjoying it and start moving quickly through it. And the more complex the game is, the more time this is going to take, and I think like playing games in general, or like even outside in the real world, like sports in general, you could argue it's kind of the same thing. You know what I mean? Like the learning period, even if this game has been finely tuned over 100 years or so, you know what I mean? There's like, you're going to not be good at it because you don't have the coordination for it. You don't understand the strategy behind it. And these are all things that you kind of need to, these are all things that you need to address.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well said. I agree with that as well. So, and I think video games is a good example, right? Because there's a natural progression there where different new versions of different new games, new systems, which require you, and this is where it comes into the experience perspective, is like you might get a new controller or a new interface or a completely different experience, right? So more recently, the systems have incorporated more like physical interaction, and now we've got the VR element as well too. So the experience starts to become immersive. So there's a lot of changes going on there, right? So if you took someone like myself who's familiar with the system from long ago and simply just handed them a current system,
it'd be like
super frustrating, right? Like totally overwhelming. But if you want that experience, you've got to learn it. Once you come up to speed about it, though, then you're experiencing something completely different. Like many versions are like an evolution on what you were using before. So I'd be curious to get your take as well too on this in terms of like striking a healthy balance. Like, how do you know that you've invested enough to create the optimal user experience without pushing it too far, right? Without pushing the user beyond their level of frustration that you think they can handle in order to gain that benefit from this improved experience. Keep hitting you with these difficult questions.
No, absolutely. So I guess part of it would be like, what is your company or client's budget? That's a good constraint. That's going to be like, all right, well, we hit the end of the road. We can't make any more iterations right now. So that's like
well said.
That's an obvious one. The next one would be, that's a really good question. because to an extent, like whenever I've worked on like a creative project before, like you never feel satisfied at the end of it. You're always like you always look at it with mild discomfort. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And like I, for instance, I'm working on a on a pretty massive project right now. It's got like over 100 pages on it, and we're doing it.
Wow.
We need it to work for all different kind of screens, and it's got a lot of different functionality to it. And as I'm going through it and I'm looking at these things, I keep seeing like, oh, we can do this a little bit better. We can do this a little better. And at some point, you got to be like, you got to draw a line, at least for the time being. Generally there's an opportunity. A lot of times there's an opportunity to go back, but not all the time. And really, a good UX project process requires consistent iteration. You know what I mean? In the most ideal environment. So I guess I would say it would probably come down to analytics, honestly. You're looking at the information and where, like, are there first you want to tackle like major bottlenecks. You know what I mean? Like there's this really important thing we want the users to do, and they're generally not doing it. Like, how can we change this? You know what I mean? So that's a good place to start. And you're going to have to do some cost benefit analysis there at the end of the day. Because this is a business. You have certain goals. And is the application achieving the goals, or or will these margins really affect our outcomes? You know what I mean? If we improve it by 10% in this area and 5% in this area, like that's how you can kind of start to attribute like it's worth jumping into this. It's worth jumping into this. I remember when I was I'm kind of going on a tangent, but I remember when I was studying UX, and there's something called user-centered design. And the concept is everything you design is for the user, or human-centered design, I think is what it was called. Everything you design is for the user. Those are your primary considerations. And it was a very humanist look. And I was surprised that they kept pushing it, because even when I was studying it, I was like, nobody's going to pay me to design something for the user. They're going to pay me to design something that accomplishes their goals. So like at the end of the day, if the project you're working on is meeting your primary goals, then you're probably in a relatively good spot. And if you have time and budget left, you can improve things on the margins. That's generally probably how I would approach that. Yeah.
I would agree as well, right? Diminishing returns. So got to get into probably never want to be in a position where you're completely satisfied, because like you said, there's always more to do to make it better.
Yeah.
But you got to do it within reason, right? Like we're trying to do it while we're controlling budgets and we're prioritizing other work that needs to get done. So those are important elements to keep in front and center for your project as well. Also, awesome. Thank you, Tim. Great conversation. I could talk about this forever, including all the products that I love and all the products that I hate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Picking on them from a UX perspective. In fact, I've thought about doing a YouTube series. Maybe you'd be interested in joining me if you're feeling up for it. But I always thought of it like a product roast, where just like tear apart software products.
I actually had this exact idea a while ago, a few months ago.
Awesome.
Yeah, I did.
I would love to do it.
I also thought
I think it would be a lot of fun.
No, absolutely. Yeah, cool. That would be great.
Yeah, let's talk more about it. For this episode, 2 other questions I have for you. The first is any resources that you'd recommend folks dive into or check out, where they can go to learn more about anything we talked about today?
Yeah, so I have 2 books, and I'm going to leave it at 2 books that that I've been into recently. One is have you heard of Rune by Design? It's by Mike Montero.
Very good. So
this one's got a bit of a political slant, not like in any like serious partisan way. At least I don't feel it is generally. But it generally, the argument is that a lot of the systemic issues that we have in society were design choices that were made on purpose, and the outcomes we're getting were actually the desired outcomes to some extent. And it's an interesting book because it legitimately views, like it approaches the world through the eye of a designer, and the people who that sounds a little conspiratorial, but a lot of the institutions who put these things together were doing these things by design. And the next one is the storm of creativity. I'm a serial procrastinator, and it's been something that I've dealt with my entire life, and especially in creative projects. Like nothing's worse than like the blank page. You know what I mean? Staring at the blank page, no matter what you're doing. And this book goes into like the creative process, why we run into these things, how to overcome these things. This one's by, I'm going to botch this name, Nia Lesky. And it's a really in-depth look at the way our creative processes work and how to approach complex creative problems. Yeah.
Thank you for the suggestions. They're unique as well, which I find super interesting. I'm looking forward to checking out both myself. We'll link to those in the show notes. And then the last question I have for you is, who should reach out to you and how can they get in touch?
If you like in general, if you're trying to improve both the visual design and the user experience of your product or piece of software that you're working on, like you're probably an ideal person to sit down and chat with me for a little bit. Or, if you're just interested in these topics, I love talking about this stuff and I love meeting new people. So no one should hesitate to reach out to me. My email is tim@euliecreative.com and my website is euliecreative.com. And that's spelled EULIE for Eulie. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Tim. I'll make sure we link to that stuff in the show notes as well, too. So if anybody didn't pick it up, just go to the show notes for this episode to get more, to make sure you've verified the correct information.
Awesome.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate you being here and sharing your knowledge.
Yeah, my pleasure. Sounds great. And hopefully we'll do this again.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Product Launch. I hope you got value out of it. I like to feature product people on my podcast because that's who I love to help. I'm a product strategist and I can help you scale your business and grow your profit through a product. If you'd like to learn more about how I can help you, email me at sean@nextstep.io. That's Sean, SEAN, at nextstep.io. Or visit my website at nextstep.io. That's nxtstep.io.